1, 2, 3.
Hi, I'm Annie.
And I'm Paula.
Welcome to the Motherhood and More podcast,
where two BFFs
that's us,
share our seasoned perspectives on motherhood.
and more.
Hi, Annie.
Hi, Paula. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. It's been quite a week here at the household. Whew. So for those of you who are parenting at different stages, some people are parenting like the little kids. We're on that other end of that at the almost empty nesting. And it is like everything's happening right now. So the past few weeks, we were on the college roller coaster with my youngest, where, she had all the decisions to make and we were getting all the financial aid stuff. And there were many, many tears because for a while it looked like she wasn't going to be able to go to her top choice school. And that she might have to go to a school that was a financial safety, which is fine because we're big on, trying to graduate with as little debt as possible. But in the end, she got the scholarship she needed, and that's very exciting. So then we're prepping for her to go in August. She's having her prom tonight.
Oh my gosh.
So much. And then my middle child is getting ready to move out of the state as well in July because he's doing a year with volunteering the city year. And then my oldest she'll be starting college online in a BS program from health management that her job is completely paying for. So she's having all of these huge transitions. So I'm sure other parents who are going through this can understand. There are times when I am simultaneously bursting with joy and needing to cry in angst. It's such a bizarre experience of being so happy for my children and so excited for what they're about to embark upon because I remember how exciting that time was. And then also just feeling this profound, almost like a preemptive loneliness, like just missing them, not necessarily a loneliness, but I'm missing them. Like they're here in the house. We're thinking about, we're preparing for something. And I'm thinking about their future. And then I just miss them, even though we're talking to each other. It's such a bizarre time in a parenting life, but that's where we are. And that's the last few weeks have been exciting. So how about you?
Dude. You're almost empty nesting, dude.
We're almost empty nesting, which has its own like super exciting experiences, when I think about all the things that, because I've been homeschooling for all these years, except for this past year. Oh, look, I just got my yarn is now stuck in my headphones. I'm knitting for those of you who are not watching, and my yarn got stuck in my headphones. So this will be fun. But what was I saying? That
oh my gosh.
You guys, everybody, we have to tell you something. If you listen to the last podcast, you know that our memories are completely shot. Annie and I are at a special time in our hormonal journeys. And I also, alongside that, I take a daily post-cancer drug that messes with the memory. So there were so many repetitions in our last podcast.
So many. And I thought maybe there was one. And part of the problem is because we talk about a lot of these things before the podcast and we've had these conversations before. So neither of us remember, like, did we talk about this with just the two of us or did we talk about it on the podcast? And then since the last podcast got split up between like 3 or 4 different recordings, oh man, we were really.
So we apologize for all of the repetitions, but so going back. Yeah. So like empty nesting is really exciting too, because I'll get to I get to do a lot of the things that I just didn't have time for before. More time with my husband. We'll be able to do more exploration in the world and that kind of a thing. But then also, I'm just used to a life filled with children of all ages. And so this is going to be crazy. So I'm going to ask you how you are, but I know how you are.
Yeah.
And so first let's introduce our topic and then ask how you are.
Okay.
Can we do that? Because our topic, it's a 2-part series and we did mental health for moms. This is on kids' mental health. And this first part today, we're going to be talking from the parenting perspective. And then the second part, we're going to actually have some kids on with us to talk a little bit about their own experiences with mental health. And so with that, how you doing, Annie?
Good. And just to piggyback off of that. So the reason that the kids will be coming on, I mentioned to my kids that we were going to be doing a podcast. Actually, I asked them if it was okay with them if we talked about mental health,
Right.
some of their mental health stuff. And the first thing my son said was like, "Can I come on the podcast? Can I be interviewed?"
Right.
Which is funny. He's the one that does not have so much of the social anxiety that the other two deal with, but they also wanted to talk. So we were really excited about the idea.
So maybe we should say, first of all, that our children, our collective 6 children, have all agreed that we can talk about them. And they've, mine gave me 1 or 2 minor parameters, but for the most part, they're really happy to have this discussion happening, because it helps everybody if we can talk about this. So you all should know that our kids completely agree with this topic of discussion. You should also know that we are not professionals in mental health. Now, I have a background in some counseling, but I'm not currently practicing. We are not professionals in mental health. This should not replace any kind of mental health treatment for you or your children. I'm just gonna go over our disclaimers, and then we'll get to you, because yours is really important. Let's see. Oh, and then the other thing we want to say is that there are some nuances that we're not going to be able to cover. The big one being, there are so many things that happen in the world, and there are discussions about whether that was an issue of mental health or whether that was an issue of hatred or bigotry. They oftentimes get confused with one another, or get lumped together when they shouldn't be, or maybe separated when they shouldn't be. We're not going to be able to get into the scope of that within this 2-part series. So just know that we are talking about things that we know to be mental health issues in our kids. So with that, Annie, how you doing?
I'm good. So my middle child finished driver's ed this week, which was so good. Not the driver's ed. Driver's ed was not so good, but the finishing of the driver's ed was so good. Because it was a huge source of stress for her, first of all, because it was a lot of hours. It was only like a 5-week class, and it was like 2 hours a night during the week, and
in person,
on top of driving in person.
Here in California, it's been online, but for you, it's in person.
No, they don't have an online option in Washington, which is really interesting. I don't know why, but that has been interesting. And it's funny because I remembered this when I taught my first child to drive, and then this time too, like the first time getting in the car. And I actually wrote an essay about this for Scary Mommy a bunch of years ago when my first kid was learning to drive, where I remember looking over at her in the driver's seat, and like, she's this full-grown woman with these long legs that are like pushing on the gas pedal, and I'm walking her through this process of learning to drive, and I know her so well that I kind of know like what things might trip her up or what she might be worried about. And just that moment of like, holy crap, like I'm literally looking at her and seeing this baby and this toddler. And it feels like it was just instantaneous. And so many parts of parenting, people always say, oh, it goes so fast and da 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 da. And a lot of times I don't feel like that. I don't feel like it's gone fast. Like I feel like I've really fully been invested in every stage of parenting, which feels like it's been a long process.
Plus,
but every once in a while you have.
Yes. Sorry, go ahead. I said to someone today, like when you have 3 poopy diapers in front of you and some of it got on the wall, you're not thinking, I really need to focus on this moment. Like, you know what I mean? It's okay to not focus on all the moments. You can focus on those now when you're looking back.
Right. And so I wrote this essay about that experience. And honestly, like still when I read it, I was reading it this morning, thinking about it. I was thinking about talking this, and it makes me want to cry because part of it is that driving is such a like huge milestone. And it made me think about all those other milestones, like when they start to walk and when, crawl and then walk and all of this. And then the driving one to me, and it didn't hit me until I was literally sitting in the passenger seat looking at my kid in the driver's seat, that like this particular milestone is something that you literally are teaching them something that's going to take them away from you.
Yes.
Like
Oh my
it
goodness.
enables
Yes.
them to leave. And it just like, whoa. At the same time, with, with all of those beautiful, warm, fuzzy, nostalgic feelings, kids who are in driver's ed are annoying to be in the car with. They just are. They know all the rules and they know all the rules that you're breaking all the time. And I was explaining to my daughter who had been, who's having it drilled into her in this driver's ed class that you drive the speed limit, explaining that like, yes, that's an important rule, but in the real world, everybody drives 4 or 5 miles above the speed limit, if not a little more on the freeway even. But she had, they show all these videos of people who had been in accidents, and then they wouldn't have been in an accident if they had not been going 5 miles over the speed limit. And a lot of this class, and this is kind of dovetailing into our topic here, really sort of traumatized her. So she's an extremely responsible kid. Like she's 17, but she's, I hate to say this, I don't think there's such a thing as a typical teenager, but there are, teenage tendencies in terms of feeling like you're immortal and that things aren't going to happen to you, and it's why there's a lot of risky behaviors among teens and whatnot. This is a very risk averse kid naturally anyway. And there were a few classes she came home from like upset, like in tears. In fact, the instructor had told us, we went to a parent orientation, the instructor had told us, he's like, during the 4th week, we get into distracted driving. There's videos that we show that are really very intense. And she came home from one of those classes and just like, Mom, I don't want to drive. And he had said that. He's like, well, we have some kids who say they don't want to drive after that week. And she's like, I don't want to drive. Why do I have to learn to drive? We talked about the importance of it being a life skill. You and I talked about this. Like if you're someplace where people around you are not able to drive for whatever reason, you need, even if you don't intend to have a car and drive places, which of course she will at some point, but it's a life skill that's important to have, especially in our country. And but it was really hard, and I kept having to tell her, I'm like, honey, this teacher is trying to instill into the kids who are not like you mentally, the kids who don't have that natural risk averseness, that don't have the anxiety about driving, that don't have those worries and those fears. They're trying to instill those worries and fears into them, which is smart. Like we want, like I was just telling you, we had a drunk driver drive through the middle of town, 19-year-old that crashed into a planter downtown. She was fine and her passenger was like mildly injured, I think, but and my daughter heard this story and she was like, how does somebody who goes through driver's ed ever drive drunk? But like, teenage brains don't always make the best decisions. And so, but it's been a process. I mean, these last 5 weeks have been rough for a couple of reasons. One, because of the intensity of what they're learning and the risks that are involved with it. And for a person who's naturally anxious, that just piles on to their already natural anxiety. And because it was in person with a teacher that she didn't know and whatnot, and she struggles with some social anxiety. So that was also on top of everything else. So the two things that she really struggles with are some social anxiety stuff, even though she's actually an excellent socializer when she's comfortable, which is true for, I think, most people with social anxiety. When they're comfortable, awesome people, amazing to talk to, but it can take a while to kind of dig down into that. And then the second anxiety she has is like performance test anxiety. So driving with this driver instructor who she doesn't know very well, being evaluated as she's driving is just this perfect storm of stress.
In a new situation where they're talking about death.
Yes. And where she's already like nervous to be behind the wheel because it is scary when you're first learning to drive. You're like, I'm in this thousands of pound vehicle that could kill somebody, and like, So
well, that
brings us.
Yeah, that brings us to our first kind of topic, which is we were talking about why there are such increases in, or it seems like the mental health challenges have really increased amongst teenagers. And I was saying to you earlier, I don't think I want to live in a world anymore where we have to, well, so now you can buy fentanyl strips where you can actually detect fentanyl in drugs. And now you can buy, there's the nail polish so that you can detect if the date rape drug is in your drink. And now, there's a whole class basically on here's a car, here's how you can die in this car or kill other people. And I think the fact is that our kids are barraged with all of this information, which is so important for them to hear, but it's anxiety producing. And so I think that one of the reasons that we talked about that there is such a rise in mental illness is we're so much more aware, first of all, of mental illnesses, but secondly, of really hard things in this world. We're aware in a way that I feel like my generation was more naive about. Now, I grew up in a house with drug users and alcoholics. And so I was aware of a lot of the things that went on in the world. And yet I still considered myself to have been a very naive teenager, even with all of that going on. And nowadays, I don't think it's easy to be naive. I mean, I think kids are exposed to so much information, and a lot of it is really scary stuff. The idea that, so my oldest daughter's girlfriend just graduated from college last night, yay, with tons of honors. So proud of her. Anyway, she was telling us how she has Narcan with her at all times. It's Narcan. It's the if somebody is overdosing on certain drugs, then you administer this and it hopefully reverses that. And she carries it with her at all times. And I believe she said she had used it 4 times already in her job on campus. That's a terrifying thing that, I cannot imagine even in a house with drug users, somebody saying, here, I'm going to give you this. And if anybody's overdosing in front of you, you're going to need to use it. So the first thing I think is there is an awareness of mental health issues, but there's also an awareness of very terrifying anxiety producing things out there in the world that our kids are hearing about and being exposed to in a way that I would imagine is rather unprecedented, at least in contemporary times.
I think you're right. And I mean, I was talking to my mom about Ella's driver's ed stuff, and she was like, I don't remember being afraid of driving. And I was thinking, yeah, your driver's ed would have been very, very, very different. I mean, they weren't even aware of drunk driving all that much at that point, right? It wasn't a big thing.
No seatbelts.
There was no seatbelts.
Yeah.
Yeah. They just drove these big tanks around, and very, very, very different. And you're right. And there are so many more things they're aware of just in general that are anxiety producing in the world. I mean, I feel that, and I didn't grow up during my formative years having all of this stuff bombarded. I mean, we've talked about this fact, like when I was growing up, we had the 6 o'clock news and newspapers, and that was it. Like we weren't bombarded 24/7 with every piece of news and every issue in the world and everybody's opinions about those things and everybody arguing about those things all the time, all day long.
I was thinking recently, so my youngest daughter, so she's homeschooled up until this year and then decided to do her senior year at a traditional public school in order to kind of transition into college. So when I was a kid, I remember we would have earthquake drills all the time because I was in Southern California. We never had never needed the earthquake drill in school. So in the entire time that I was in school, we never needed the earthquake drill. My daughter has been in school for 1 year and she has had 2 bomb threats. 2 bomb threats where they had to evacuate everybody to the field. I mean, I remember the anxiety that those earthquake drills produced in me as a child, and we never ever needed it. And here my daughter has these bomb threats, bomb drills, and then has had to use them twice already. That's and you think about shooter drills and the very real threat of shooters. So I think when we're looking at why there's an increase in mental health challenges for kids, awareness of both the disease and the issues facing kids are a big one. I've written about genetics a lot, that my youngest is the only child who's genetically connected to me, and of my 3 children. And a lot of the things that she struggles with from a mental health perspective are parallel to what I struggle with. And you can definitely argue that there is a lot of me passing my anxieties down to her. And she and I have really talked about that. And that is absolutely true. But there are other things that are just, I can see the lineage from my mom and her mom all the way down. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about this, but my mom didn't tell me that she had mental illness, that she was struggling with mental illness issues. And I didn't know it until she was close to death. And boy, do I wish I had known it, because I can draw those lines pretty clearly down to my child. And that's hard, because I think as our populations grow and as we have more and more things challenging our mental illnesses, our mental health, we're going to be passing down more things through genetics. You and I talked about the internet being a huge factor. A lot of that is our kids are seeing these things 24/7. The internet is interesting. Annie, you and I have talked a lot about with homeschooling that sometimes it's funny when people talk about homeschooling being bad for socialization. And yet what we've discovered is, really, do you want a bunch of 12-year-olds socializing your 12-year-old? I mean, it's really much better when you can have intergenerations of people helping to socialize your 12-year-old. And I think the internet is like when kids get mental health information, when kids get news information, when kids get trend information from this vast internet, it's not the best source of information for them.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, you and I are writers on the internet. We have lots of experience with the comment section. But I think about this too with a couple of my kids, and one of them, it seems very clear to me that some of the anxiety about some of the social anxiety stuff about worrying about saying the wrong thing, or worrying about being criticized, like things that they enjoy nowadays. Like it used to be when we were kids, if there was something we enjoyed and we would enjoy it, that was just it.
Right.
Now, if there's something they enjoy, they can see, hundreds of people commenting on that thing and criticizing it from every different angle. And, there's so much criticism on the internet. There's so much just toxic, gross stuff that they're seeing, even if they're even if you're trying to filter things out and whatnot. But I mean, you watch a YouTube video of somebody's YouTube stuff that you really enjoy that's about science or whatever. And if you start going through the comments, there's people who are, complaining about things in a way that would definitely, if that's what you're seeing growing up during those formative years of seeing how people are interacting and whatnot, like you would think you're constantly being judged, because everybody that puts anything on the internet is constantly being judged. And I wonder how much that has to do with some of the worries about saying things wrong or being criticized.
Because a lot of this stuff is things that kids might never have thought about, So kids are seeing opinions about things that they love, maybe even about themselves, that are contradictory to what they know. And that has to affect their levels of anxiety.
Yeah. And I think, the other thing too, the pandemic, right? The pandemic has made all of us spend more time online, which has probably just exacerbated all of those issues. And, kids and adults are much more likely to say things online that they wouldn't say to somebody's face, because they don't see the reaction. They don't, they don't have those little strings of empathy, which most people do have, that get plucked if you're looking somebody in the eye and saying something unkind. Very, very different than when you are looking at a screen where you don't see the person's reaction.
Well, and so much of our social development, it's trial and error. I think about like when kids are 9 and 10 and they're developing their sense of humor, and it's always so awkward and so bad. 9 and 10-year-olds have such a developing sense of humor, and they really learn by tossing things out and seeing how it lands. So I remember, my son in particular, he could not figure out knock jokes. He really couldn't figure out like the concept of a joke. He's very funny, but he couldn't figure out the concept of how to tell a joke. And so he would toss these out, and I was always very honest, and I'd be like, okay, I can see where you're going, but here's where you're missing, that kind of a thing. Now, that's his mom telling him, that's a funny concept, but let's hone it a little bit. Now imagine putting a joke out and everybody sees it and a bunch of people respond. And maybe some people are angry, and maybe some people feel hurt by it, and maybe some people feel, or just think it's stupid and they tell you that. That's going to make it very hard for you to tell another joke. And yet socially, from a developmental perspective, that's part of developing. Part of developing is saying ideas that probably are not, necessarily even kind ideas. Not, maybe they might be very ignorant ideas. They might be ideas that could be hurtful to other people. But if you don't feel like there's a space that you can drop those into and get feedback on, it's a lot harder to develop in a healthy way. I think back to the times when I said something. I remember one time being in high school, and one of my friends had said something, and I did not swear very much in high school, but I called him a not nice word. It's the part of a body, his body. And I called him that 2 or 3 times, kind of like exploring that word because I had heard it tossed around. And the response was he was pretty hurt by it, and at first he tried to kind of laugh it off. And then he said, actually, that's kind of hurtful. And I never called another person that word ever again. And I think that's such an important part of growing up. And I think when so much of growing up is happening on the internet, it's harder to get really accurate feedback because you're getting feedback from so many different voices who are all going through their own journeys.
Right. Yeah. And it doesn't even always have to be directly directed toward you. Like my kids actually haven't spent a lot of time on social media. They don't share much on social media. They kind of will look through social media and whatnot. But it isn't like they've been bullied or something like that. Not at all. But they see it happening.
They see it.
And that's enough to create, that feeling of like, oh, and that might be part of why they don't share much, because they don't want to be subjected to that, which I totally understand, even though I have plunged myself into that world over the years with writing on the internet. Every once in a while, I'm like, what am I doing? Why do I do this?
I know.
Because the comment section can be so ridiculous. And I used to engage more. I used to, get into discussions and whatnot. And in recent, last 2 years, last year or so, I have no desire. I'm just tired. But
because it does affect you. Subject. It affects you. Yeah. I know that when my kids have read comments that were said about things that I've written, they were affected by that.
I've had friends who get so angry. I mean, I've had friends who were just fuming at comments that people made about something that I wrote, where I was like, really, it's okay. Like, it's just like not that big of a deal because I'm so used to it. But oh man, I have people get very protective, which is very sweet, but it's not a nice place in a lot of ways.
It's not. But there are positives as well. And there are positives, I think, to mental health issues that our kids might face. So, I mean, one of the great things about the internet is that if a child is feeling something that is confusing to them and they don't feel like they have adults in their life that they can talk to, they can at least do some initial research. Yeah. Unfortunately, sometimes it goes too far, as we just said, but at least they can put in. So for example, you might have a child who's 12 or 13 who's suddenly, I'm sad all the time, and they want to put that in, or why am I so angry? I mean, there is support on the internet if you go to the right places, so I almost wonder if that's something that should be taught in a curriculum in some way, because the kids who probably have to Google those kinds of things are not getting that information from their parents. Maybe.
That's true. Right. Yeah.
So it would be kind of like when we were kids and there were courses on identifying, like we would have somebody come in and speak, identifying if somebody in your family has a problem with alcohol, identifying if there's abuse in anybody, things like that. It might be good to have some computer literacy, some internet literacy things for our kids so that they're searching for the right things. So, if you're feeling extra sad, here are some places for you to go, because I do think the internet can be great. And I'll see sometimes on the flip side of the social media, I'll see, a kid post maybe themselves in that outfit that they're worried they're awkward in, and get a ton of feedback. Oh, you look great. I love this. Love you so much. Or whatever all the teen vernacular is that I could not possibly start to slay. That's a big one. Slay, with lots of letters and lots of exclamation points. Like all of that can be that can help build kids up as well. Mm-hmm. So there are positives to the internet. And then we were also talking about different positives to mental health issues. Like in some ways, when you really think about it, challenges to our mental health are in some ways a superpower. My anxiety protected me from a childhood that was fraught with abuse and substance abuse in the people around me. And that anxiety kept me always alert for something going on. I don't need it anymore. And I'm trying to work with my anxiety to tell it I don't need it anymore. Mm-hmm. But it is a superpower. And when you think about like your kids, I like to joke with Annie that her kids have the Soshankst. And I say it's kind of like a mythical character, the Soshankst, because social anxiety in some ways is really protecting your kids. And maybe you can talk about that for a second.
Well, yeah. I think it has protected them from a lot of the teenage pitfalls that you sort of fall into. That some of it can be very normal, but there are, I think sometimes we don't recognize or acknowledge enough that some of the things that happen during the teen and young adult years can be genuinely, truly traumatizing for a long time. Choices that people make as teenagers that, often in society sort of just get brushed off as like, oh, it's just teenage rebellion or teenage experimentation or whatever. Like some of those things have some very real consequences.
Boys being boys.
Oh my gosh. I mean, so many things where you could get yourself into some big trouble in all different kinds of ways that my kids being much more socially reserved protects them from a lot of those things, which, I mean, you have to strike a balance, right? Like,
right.
But you're right, it is protective. And then, my oldest daughter, her main anxiety issue is emetophobia, which is a clinical fear of vomiting. And we can get into specifics of that, but that has protected her from a lot of things, from food poisoning to, I don't think she will ever experiment with any kind of substances because she won't even take normal medication that might possibly have nausea as a side effect. So, and some of this is, you and I, when we talk about these sort of upsides or positives of mental health disorders, some of it is our processing of like, okay, let's find the silver lining here, because so much of it is really, really hard to deal with.
Well,
I mean, it's not that we're saying like, oh, it's great to have anxiety. No. It's not that. It's really part of our process as parents of like, okay, what good can I find in this? Because holy crap, this is rough.
Well, and I also think that there's something to asking important questions. How might this be serving my child? So, I am terrified of becoming an addict of any sort because of the addicts in my family. And so I don't drink. And that's a good piece of protective. That's good for me. I mean, there are some pitfalls to it. It's kind of in some ways, it can be a real bummer to be afraid of drinking, but at the same time, it protects me from a very real issue. And I think if a child has any kind of that sort of history in their life or a tendency towards addiction, that's not a bad thing. So I do think that us asking, maybe at the very core, when our kids have some sort of a mental health challenge going on, how is this mental health challenge serving our kids? Because kids are adaptive. They're so adaptive in ways that we forget as adults that we once were, and they develop adaptations. And I think a lot of those adaptations just go a little too far and they become, a mental illness. And maybe that's as parents where we have to try to figure things out when we're striking that balance. Is this a protective function? Is there a protective function here that's now just gone too far? Like the Soshankst, a little soak shanks is not a bad thing in a world where we have to have fentanyl strips to determine if there's any fentanyl laced in our things. A little soak shanks isn't a bad thing in a world where hanging out with your friends, if that means drinking and then driving, and you are too afraid to do that, that's not a bad thing. It becomes a challenge when it is interfering with a healthy life for our teenagers. And that maybe we could move on to share a little bit of our own story and then talk about detecting how we as parents can detect mental illnesses. So do you want to start with our family stories, or do you want me to start?
Sure. No, you can start. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, basically, and again, my kids have given me permission to talk about these things. My oldest two children, as I've said in the podcast before, we adopted. They were 2 and 3, maybe 4 years old when we adopted them. And so one, they had lived in a situation in which they were impoverished, which is a trauma in and of itself. And then they also had lived in orphanages and had been moved to a few different orphanages. Plus, adoption in and of itself carries big challenges, can carry big challenges to the mental health of a child, especially at different phases throughout their development. So that's my oldest two children. And so we process a lot of PTSD from those experiences. My kids also struggle with RBTS. Are you familiar with that, Annie? RBTS?
RBTS. No.
It is basically it's race-based traumatic stress. And it's finally a topic that is being researched and talked about in more detail at this point. But it's when people are confronted with racism. So we're talking about people within the BIPOC community are confronted with racism. There can be trauma in that. And then especially when it's repeated over and over and over again. And so I've very sadly watched my kids go through those experiences. Obviously, I'm white, they are Black. So I'm not experiencing it myself, but I'm seeing how it affects them. And my oldest child, for example, I would say not a week goes by where she doesn't have somebody confront her about her race at her job. And it becomes traumatic, and it becomes at the least depressing. But it can also be traumatic. And so they struggle with both those things. These cause anxiety, they can cause depression. And it comes at different phases throughout their development. Then my youngest also struggles with anxiety, little bit of depression, and then obsessive compulsive disorder. And going back to talking about the positives of mental health challenges, interestingly, her obsessive compulsive disorder developed in a way that she can put a lot of her anxiety and depression into the routines that come out of her OCD. So it's almost like this brilliant way that her brain has found to compartmentalize the anxiety and the depression so that she can function on a daily basis. And I know if you have children, or you yourself are living with OCD, you know that it's not at all that simplistic, and that it is a very challenging disorder to deal with. And we can both see how it is this incredible adaptive tool that her brain has put together to deal with the anxiety and the depression that I gave her genetically. So that's where we are as a family. And how about you?
Yeah. So when you talked about genetics, it's really been fascinating. Two of our kids struggle with health anxiety in sort of similar and different ways, which very clearly comes through my husband's side of the family. He also struggles with health anxiety. And it's basically what they used to call hypochondria. They don't really call it hypochondria anymore. They call it health anxiety. But My oldest and my youngest struggle with that, and the reason that we know it's genetic isn't just because my husband has it, but my oldest, like I said, struggles with emetophobia. So does her cousin, who is on my husband's side. So no, like it's not like there's clearly a genetic component there. And then what I
Right.
honestly believe, because I had a huge aversion to throwing up when I was a kid, not an anxiety that debilitated me in the way that it has her, but my mom used to joke about how I would literally like will it away. Like I hated throwing up so much, and nobody loves it, but like I extra
Right.
hated it. And then hers just goes to this huge clinical level. And so the
Which often
combination, I think, of
happens, right? That often happens when
mhm.
you, as you go down in the generations, what was manifested in one way in a parent can be manifested in a much more concentrated way in the child.
Yeah. So I mean, this has been going on for a long, long time, and it took us a long time to figure it out because the way emetophobia works is you're afraid of throwing up to the point where you won't talk about it at all. Like she wouldn't say the word vomit. She wouldn't say throw up.
Right.
And so she'd never say, I'm afraid of throwing up, really. Like we sort of had to deduce it over the years and try to differentiate what it was from just a generalized anxiety. So emetophobia is often misdiagnosed as generalized anxiety and or an eating disorder because there's a whole lot of food avoidance that goes along with being afraid of
Right.
throwing up. And it's a particularly challenging disorder to treat, even though it's actually very, very treatable. It just has to be treated in a very specific way. And but part of the reason it's so debilitating is that unlike a lot of phobias that are situational, like if you're afraid of heights, you're fine unless you're around heights. If you're afraid of spiders, you're fine unless you're around spiders.
Right.
If you're emetophobic, you're afraid of throwing up, you're literally just afraid of your own body. And you're afraid of two main things in life that we can't avoid, which is food, because any food you eat at any given time could have foodborne illness on it, right? Like we all know this. We just live
Right.
our lives as if everything's fine until it's not. But if you're emetophobic, like that becomes an obsession. And two, other people, because anybody that you know could have some kind of a stomach illness and pass it along to you without knowing it, before you're symptomatic or they're symptomatic or whatever. And so if it goes untreated, emetophobia becomes more and more and more debilitating because they start avoiding more and more things that are things you can't live without, like food and people. And so our daughter was becoming pretty much agoraphobic. Like she'd spend more
Mhm.
and more and more time in her room, more and more time just like canceling plans with friends, constantly checking if food was okay, constantly asking us for reassurance. Um, and we finally found a therapist who was able to help her get started on her journey to healing. And we're still in the process because she ended up moving out of state across the country halfway through Avery's treatment. So we're still we're still going through the process of treating it, but she's a lot better now. And then my middle child is, and then my oldest also struggles with some social anxiety, which part of that, and this is also something that
Right.
parents should probably know, certain things can piggyback off of each other. So I think a lot of her social anxiety issues came from the period of time, and this was like her middle teen years, where it was really, really bad, where she became more and more reclusive and just wasn't doing a lot of social things because she was so afraid of throwing up and afraid of being around people, and it was such an obsession that, like, there was a lot of social skills that she just wasn't building and wasn't practicing during that time period. um and even when she was around her friends and whatnot, like those thoughts are so,
Right.
I mean, just that constant fear, is very limiting. So some of that piggybacked off of that. And then our middle child has struggled with social anxiety and like performance anxiety. That's a lot of perfectionism, those kinds of things that trying to figure out, how do I not like constantly be afraid of being judged or being tested.
Right.
And that started somewhat young too, I remember. And the things you don't think about at the time when kids are little, like she hated timed tests, like hated them to a degree that was not just like, oh, I really don't like to be timed. It was like super anxiety producing. And then and the same thing with grades. Like she really worried about her grades. Like if she's not doing well, We didn't even do grades. Like I super de-emphasized grades. Like we've never been that family or those parents of like you have to get good grades because we didn't even
Right.
do grades as homeschoolers. And then once they started taking classes at community college or whatever, like I just want them to do their best. Like I don't care if they get. In fact, I told my daughter one time, I'm like, I hope you get a B one of these days because I think it'll help you. I think it'll help you like realize it's not the end of the world if you don't get an A.
You should put that on a
So
pillow. I
funny.
hope you get a B one of these days.
And then our youngest also struggles with the health anxiety and somewhat of the emetophobia. And I'm not sure how much of that is having seen,
Right.
he's witnessed a lot of that. Um, Now, what's interesting is that, like I said, my husband struggles with health anxiety, but he really tried to shield the kids from that. Like it
Right.
wasn't like he was going around talking about it all the time when we were kids because he didn't want to pass it along. And so it's been very interesting. And that's why I feel like the genetic component is really huge because we've watched them still, all this stuff manifest in them that it isn't like it was learned behavior. There may be, like I said, some stuff with my youngest just because he was around when we were talking about all of this stuff with my eldest. But what's interesting too is that he is really open about his anxieties, and it's really sweet. And I think part of that is because he's grown up in this environment where it's talked about very normally. Like we talk about mental health stuff the same way that we talk about physical health stuff. Like, oh, my stomach feels weird today, or like, oh, I twisted my ankle. Like, you talk about those things without any judgment, without any stigma, without any, those are just physical things that happen. And we've always talked about mental health in the same way, which is part of why I think they were so open to the idea of talking about it and brought it up themselves that they wanted to talk about
Right.
it. And my oldest has talked a lot, and I wrote an article about this for Upworthy, thanking people who had shared their stories
Right.
openly, because if people hadn't shared their own emetophobia stories, we would have never had any idea that that was even a thing and that that was what she was struggling with. And pinpointing that diagnosis was absolutely vital to getting her the help that she needed. And so having people who were willing to be open and talk about their struggles and their journeys and all of that has been such a huge thing for us. And my daughter knows that she's really open about it because she wants to be able to help whoever. Like anytime I write about it, I always ask her, like, are you still cool with me writing about this? Like, is this, because I'm
Right.
absolutely would not if they had any issue with it. And she's always like, no, absolutely. Like, and I have readers send me messages every time an article comes out where I talk about this, send me messages saying, oh my gosh, I think my kid is dealing with this too. I didn't know there was a word for it or whatever. And they're always asking for my therapist's phone number. I'm like, if you're not in the same state, we probably can't share a therapist. Um, but my daughter has even been open to chatting with people if they want to about,
Yeah.
if there's a teenager or something like, so it's that openness to it is such a huge thing.
I think that kind of takes us into, well, I'm a little out of order here, but a little bit about um, how we know if our kids are experiencing some mental health challenges, because so let's be real, a whole lot of how kids behave can look disordered.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when you have
Yeah.
a 3-year-old, I remember the first time a 3-year-old, one of my 3-year-olds, said to me, can I have some orange juice? And I remember giving the child the orange juice and having them throw a tantrum. I wanted milk. And the parenting mind, and we've talked about this before, that I didn't have good examples of parents. So especially my mind goes to, is my child a sociopath? Because that feels like toddlers are sociopaths, basically. If we're allowed to joke about it for just a second,
Yes.
it can feel like that. Or when you look at the moodiness that goes on for young preteens and teenagers, it can feel disordered. And
Yeah.
so I think a big challenge for us parents is knowing when we're dealing with normal behaviors, when we're dealing with disordered behaviors, and then throw into the mix like things like adoption. Well, okay, what's normal for a child who's not adopted? What's normal for a child who is adopted? I have a child with a chronic illness. What's normal for a child with a chronic illness that might not be normal for a kid who doesn't have a chronic illness. But so there's so many things that we can put into this mix that I think one can cause us to either overdiagnose or underdiagnose our kids, with which both can be problems when we're trying to deal with mental health. So I'm
and
going
it can be hard to oh, sorry.
No,
Can I
go,
just
go,
say
go,
something
go.
really
Yeah.
quick? It can be really hard to figure out. I mean, I think it's just good to know, like, it isn't like we have the answers of how to figure this out, because it's so hard.
Right.
One thing that happened with my kids, now I'm going to talk about suicidal ideation for a moment, just so that people know. All three of my kids, at some point when they were around, I want to say 11, 12, 13, somewhere in there, came to me and said, Mom, I can't stop thinking about suicide. I was like, okay. I mean, those are words you don't want to hear as a parent,
Right.
first of all, right? But then I also knew my kids, and I knew how that health anxiety works, where they would work. I mean, anything they heard about that they'd never heard about before that was a health issue, whether it was a mental health issue or physical health issue, they would start ruminating about.
Right.
Thinking that they had, right? As a health anxiety person, like, you start thinking you have symptoms of things that you hear
Right.
about. That's part of the anxiety. So I had to kind of parse out with them, is this something that you just can't stop thinking about as an idea? Or is it something that you are actually feeling about wanting to do, or having thoughts, or, are you thinking that you actually feel like you want to end your life? Like, had to have this uncomfortable conversation with a 12, 13,
Right.
11, 13-year-old kid. But I know how important it is to actually get to the bottom of these things. But with all three of them, it was obsessing about the idea of it, because they had heard about it. At that age, you sort of become more aware of, like, oh,
Right.
this is a thing that happens. And all three of them were terrified that it was something that would just happen to them, that they couldn't control. That it would just be something, like, out of the blue, they would just all of a sudden do.
Right.
And it was
Which is
weird
not
thing.
an unwarranted fear, by the way, because in
Right.
people who are depressed, that is what happens. That can happen.
And so I had to, right. So I had to have the conversation of, like, okay, and really parse it out with them. Like, is this a feeling you're having, or is it a fear of the feeling that you're having? And with all three of them, it was a fear of the feeling. They were afraid of feeling that.
Right.
And they were afraid that it was just going to all of a sudden happen, and that they wouldn't have any control over it, and that it would just be like, like having a heart attack or something like that. And so it was a tricky thing.
That's so,
with them, it was pretty clear after the conversation that was what it was. But I kept thinking to myself, like, what if I'm wrong? What if what if this is really something that, so it's hard as a parent to figure these things out.
Well, it's also hard when a lot of the things that you hear can be contradictory, and can be contradictory to experiences. And speaking again about suicidal ideation, the common line that you hear when you talk to mental health practitioners is to ask, are you putting into plans a suicide? Well, I attempted suicide 3 times as a child, and in none of those times did I plan it. None of them. It was every single time it was completely spontaneous. And so I really worry about that advice. I think that and I know some people who unfortunately have completed suicide, and in none of those cases was it planned either. Or if there was a plan, it was in the last half an hour leading up to it. And so I think there can be a lot of advice out there that's really contradictory. And I did look up a list about what to look for. And let me just say this, I'm huge on looking at patterns in people, and patterns in myself, patterns in my children, patterns in the world. And I used to be, well, I still can be in some ways, ask my kids, very reactionary. And that's a trauma response, right? I mean, being reactionary is an anxiety trauma response in many ways. Like, I had a lot of things to react to as a child. And so my body still reacts to things in a reactionary way. As you know, because if the snake crosses my road, I will push whoever is with me to the snake and run. And I got to prove this last week on a hike with 2 friends. And I had just told them, just so you know, if a snake crosses our path, I will not protect you. I will run. A snake crossed our path. I ran. Like I'm a fight or flight kind of person. so I like to look at patterns. And
Mm-hmm.
when my children presented with things that looked like they were a mental health struggle, what I tried to do was look at an overall pattern. So for example, I have one kid that, like me, tends to be very reactionary. And so if that child was screaming because I gave them orange juice instead of milk when they asked for orange juice at 3 years old, I could look at the patterns. Hey, this is a child that normally reacts strongly to things. And so doesn't seem out of the ordinary for this child. Now I have another child. If that child had reacted in that way, I would wonder, ooh, what's going on here? This is not a typical reaction for this particular child would typically be like, oh, you gave me orange juice? Okay, that sounds cool. I mean, I could give this child like water with sand in it, and the child would be like, okay, if this is what you want me to drink, that's what I'm drinking. And so I think that when we're looking at this list that I'm about to just kind of present a few things in terms of what we're supposed to look for in our kids, it's really important that we're looking at the pattern of our child. And I think that a good marker for us to consider is, has there been a marked change in my child's normal patterning? And because some changes are normal, right? A kid goes from always being with the family to around puberty, and now they're in their room for a long time. That's pretty normal. That's a normal big behavioral switch. So we have normal behavioral switches. But I think the question then becomes, is this behavioral switch becoming an unhealthy pattern?
Yeah.
So they had a pattern of this, they switched to a new behavior. Is that becoming an unhealthy pattern? So a simple example might be, all of a sudden my child who looked at social media here and there is now looking at social media every waking hour, and it's actually interrupting their schoolwork, and they're no longer going out with their friends, and they're no longer talking to us about their issues, which is normal for a kid to not talk to a parent about certain issues. But is it becoming now an unhealthy pattern? That's a time that you might need to say, what else is going on here? Because not only has there been a shift in behavior, but that shift is becoming an unhealthy pattern. So I just want to say, that's what I have tended to do when I'm trying to figure out what's a normal part of growing up, what's a normal part of having been adopted, having a chronic illness, whatever the situation might be. So I'm going to link this in the show notes, but there is a great website about our children's mental health. And some of the things that they say to look for are, they say that to look for a big change in behavioral patterns. Look at language development. Has it shifted in any way? So we're looking at younger children, because children can be any age and manifest with symptoms of mental illness. And so we want to be keeping an eye on this. Problems listening your behavior in a way that they didn't have a problem listening or behaving before. They talk about things like trouble sitting still in a child who that's not necessarily their general energy level, or trouble sitting still in a way that's inconsistent with their age. Concentration, this is a big one. I think for teenagers, especially when they're stopped being able to concentrate on things they've normally been able to concentrate on, that can be a sign of especially anxiety. Like you said, with your oldest, constantly thinking about, in this situation, could somebody vomit at this point? So trouble concentrating, being in the moment, a sudden shift in friendships, suddenly their moods are less sporadic and more elongated in what might be perceived as negative ways. So long periods of depression, long periods of anxiety, long periods of anger. Sleep disruption. I think, that was on my list earlier and I forgot to say it. I think one of the number one things impacting kids nowadays in terms of mental health is sleep. Sleep is so important. I personally have observed that my teenagers need more sleep than they did even when they were toddlers. And I think that there are a lot more things disrupting our sleep. So sleep disruption, major patterns in changes of eating that again are a negative pattern. So not, every girl right before puberty starts to eat a ton. And it's normal for boys around 14, 15 to eat, like we used to joke, that my son would have his pre-breakfast and then his breakfast and then his post-breakfast and then his snack and then his pre-lunch, so that's a normal
Mm-hmm.
shift in eating patterns. But like you had observed with your oldest child, who's just basically kind of stopped eating so much because of this
Mm-hmm.
fear that the food could cause vomiting. Um, Concerns and fears beyond what's normal, shyness or avoidance of people beyond what's typical for their patterning. My youngest has always been a very shy person, so I would have to look beyond the shyness to determine
Yeah.
if something was more of an anxiety manifesting itself. New patterns of anger or violence, fear of things that they weren't afraid of before in an unhealthy pattern. So maybe being afraid of going to school. Yeah, thoughts of suicide. But again, like you learned, you had to converse, like, what's the fear here? Is it that you might commit suicide, or that you've learned about this thing that is scary for you? Obviously, use of substances. This is an interesting one, doing things on purpose to get in trouble. That can happen a lot with kids who have been through trauma or PTSD, where they're not able to say what is going on or even know what is going on, but getting in trouble sort of helps to bring the parents or the caregivers into a closer relationship with them at that time when they might need it. And then loss of interest in their usual activities or sudden change in their grades or their behaviors, like I said before, beyond their patterns. So do you have anything? I'm going to link the article to that, but do you have anything to add
Yeah.
to what those professionals are saying?
Um, the only thing that I would add is that again, it can be really tricky to
Yeah.
differentiate between something that's normal child or teen behavior, or that's normal for your child, or that is not. Like you talked about, shyness versus social anxiety. Well, that could be a tricky thing to
Right.
figure out. And a normal fear versus anxiety, like um, our kids didn't like, none of them have liked scary movies. Although it's funny, is my youngest two now, as teenagers, have started really enjoying horror video games. Not
Oh,
horror like gross, not gross like gory stuff, but sort of like there's a couple of different ones. One of them is called like Poppy's Playtime, and it's just sort of like this eerie game that takes place in this old like toy factory and stuff. So it's just
right.
a lot of like kind of spooky, eerie stuff with a lot of like jump scares and like creepy music and stuff. And they actually enjoying that. And I actually think, and there's some, I should look it up and I'll find it and we can put it in the show notes too. There's some research about how people with anxiety can actually be helped by
Yeah.
watching horror movies, which to me was like, what? Because part of the thing, and one of the questions that I have as a parent of kids with anxiety is how much how much of this, I mean, it's obviously something that would have happened regardless of what we did as parents. But sometimes I wonder how many things I did as a parent or we did as parents that either made it worse or just didn't make it better.
Oh, right.
Um, like
Right.
like my kids would avoid scary things. Like they just would avoid scary things, which I totally get because I don't like scary things. And so I wouldn't ever
Right.
push them to do something that was scary to them. Like that seemed cruel. Um, but there are times when pushing beyond that initial fear is actually a good thing for anxiety. And one of the things that we learned with therapy with my oldest is that um, if you want to make anxiety worse, avoid the thing you're anxious about. Like that's
Right.
the number one way to make the anxiety worse is avoidance. And then a second thing that makes anxiety worse, which parents, again, this is not medical advice, obviously talk to your own therapists, but every therapist that we have seen has talked about the fact that one thing that anxiety wants is reassurance. So, like when our
Yes.
daughter would ask us, is this food okay? Does this smell okay? Are you sure? Are you 100% sure? I mean, literally, it would be like six different questions in a row. Is this food okay? Does it smell okay? Are you sure? It smells weird to me. Can you taste it for me? Like over and over again. And we would go along with it for a while, thinking, like, well, she just needs, if we reassure her enough times, then it'll be fine. Then she'll recognize that it's fine. And we learned from the therapist that that is absolutely not what we should have been doing.
Right.
She was like, if she asks you if something is okay, you can tell her once yes, or smell it once and be like, okay, yeah, smells fine to me, and then don't answer anymore. And that was a really tricky thing as a parent, because what you want to do is tell them everything's going to be okay.
Right.
But the problem is with anxiety, they just keep asking over and over and over again. And that reassurance actually reinforces the anxiety. There's all kinds of counterintuitive stuff like that that we learned in therapy that is part of the reason why finding therapists that can help is really, really important.
Because I think it's important for us as parents and for all parents to know we can't fix this for our kids. We cannot. What we can do is offer our children really good toolboxes that they can use for their very specific mental health journey. So for one kid, that might mean talk therapy plus a medication plus some habits that they can add into their life that are helpful. For another child, it could mean something totally different. I have a toolbox for my mental health that includes walking and hiking and running. I can't take medication. I've said that before on the podcast. It includes journaling. It includes new things that I'm doing right now. And we're going to have some resources at the end. But yeah, I think that we can provide our kids with a toolbox, but we can't take this from them, away from them. We can't fix it for them. Yeah. I often say to my kids, this is a part of your life now forever. And there might be times when it's a very small part of your life. And there might be times when it's a really big and overwhelming part of your life. And just the trick is figuring out what you need in your toolbox when, and just understanding that this is a part of your life that you'll be dealing with. And you kind of have to get used to it. It's a part of our kids' lives. We can't stop them from having it. We can't protect them from it, but we can help them to have some tools. And I think that what's really hard, so we said that one hard thing as a parent is figuring out the balance or the tension between, is this normal or is this not normal? Is for us as parents, we want to help, but we can feel so powerless and helpless in these situations. Even so, as a person who deals with mental illness myself, I feel more powerful about my own mental illness struggles than I do in terms of my kids, because I know what I can do in those situations for myself, even if what I have to do is shut down in some way or reach out for help. But I can't do those things for my kids. And that helplessness, I remember going through the emetophobia with you, and just that feeling of where do I even begin? How do I?
Yeah. There were times. So one example of this feeling of helplessness in the moment, when my daughter was really in the throes of the emetophobia in the worst stage. She was probably 16.
Right.
And she was in a youth orchestra, and I would take her to orchestra practice. And orchestra is something she loved to do. She enjoyed it. We would get to orchestra practice and she couldn't make herself get out of the car. Just couldn't do it. She's like, I can't, Mom, I can't. And then as a parent, so I'm like, okay, what do I do in this situation? Because I want to help her get out of the car. Is this a situation where it takes tough love? Like, do I need to make her get out of the car? I can't carry her out of the car, because I knew from experience, because we'd been through this. I mean, we went through this many times, getting to orchestra and not being able to get out of the car, or getting to anything, violin lessons or different things a party that she wanted to go to, couldn't get out of the car. And sometimes it was like, okay, if I take her home, then I'm just reinforcing the fact that it's that letting the fear win, basically letting the anxiety win. I would try everything I could think of to get her out of the car, from, talking through the anxiety to, and I'm embarrassed to say it, but honestly, in that moment, what do you do? Like, sometimes I would get frustrated and be like, oh my God, just get out of the car. Right. Just get out of the freaking car. Because I knew once she got in there and got past that big hump of getting out of the car and into wherever she needed to go, 95% of the time it was fine. But how do you can't just pick up an adult-sized child and shove them
Right.
over that hump. Like, what do you do? So that helpless feeling of like, I don't know what to do here. I don't know what to do because I know if I just turn around and go home, it's just going to make it worse. But I can't force her to get out of the car. Like, and there was a lot of those kinds of things. And then there was the like she was old enough and she's very, very smart and she recognizes this, right? So like sometimes she would feel really bad that we had to deal with this stuff. And I'm like, honey, it's
Mm,
not like I appreciate the fact that you are feeling sympathy for me as a parent to have to go through this, but at the same time, like you're the one that's struggling. Like,
right.
the hardest part is watching you struggle. Like it's
I
so hard
That is such
as
an
a parent.
important thing to remember. And I think I've said this a lot. As hard as it is as a parent, imagine what it's like for the child experiencing that. It's
Yeah.
just so much more challenging. And our kids mostly do know,
Yeah.
they know when it's hard. And so that's just such a huge struggle. I wrote an article about when my daughter was diagnosed with juvenile arthritis, and I said that we were trying to figure out the best way to help her continue to function without having the JA hold her back, although there are times when something like that does hold you back. And in the article, I say that I would say to her, I want you to go as far as you think you can go. And then I want you to go just a little bit further, just a little
Mm-hmm.
bit further. And when we would be out walking or biking or whatever, and she would be experiencing pain, that tended to really help, because if she could go a little bit further, she would feel triumphant. And
Yeah.
I have a similar approach to a lot of the mental health issues, not all of them. There are times when obviously you would not want to do that. And all of this is supported with therapeutic intervention and therapeutic help.
Mm-hmm.
But when I will say, okay, I know you're feeling like you can't do this. And by the way, I do this for myself as well. What can you do? I want us to try to do what we think we can do and then just go a tiny bit further. So for example,
Mm-hmm.
with your oldest, maybe getting into the violin rehearsal was not going to happen, but maybe if she could walk to the door and back. And I
Mm-hmm.
know it sounds simplistic, but for me, it tends to do wonders. And I know for my kids, it has done wonders too. I know that this situation is very scary. Let's talk about what you think you can do. And that does bring me to another part of this, is the parent. Is it's a parenting, as parents, we have to do so much preemptively and
Mm-hmm.
and posthumously. So a lot of that preemptiveness is talking about mental illness in a very, very open ways. I remember one time I had a really hard day of depression when my kids were all really young. And up to that point, I hadn't really talked to them about depression. And I just thought, I need to be alone today. And so, but I didn't want them to feel like it was because of them in any way, shape, or form. So I decided to have a conversation with them and explain that sometimes I get really sad, and that sadness has a word, and that word is depression. And when that happens, sometimes I need to be alone, and it's not anybody's fault. It has nothing to, it's just the way my brain is working. And I did, and I was alone. And it was very interesting to me. They were pretty young when this happened, because after that, my kids were more verbal about saying, mommy, I'm having one of those days like you sometimes have. I just feel really sad.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that sadness would last 20 minutes, for them. But it was I think the more we can do preemptively, we talk to our kids about their bodies, we talk to our kids about all kinds of safety issues preemptively. I think we have to talk to our kids preemptively about mental health.
Yeah.
And then I think when our kids are in a really challenging experience, so for example, kids who have a panic disorder, when they're in a panic attack, that's not the time to talk to them. The time to talk
Mm-hmm.
to them is when they're calm, sometime afterwards. Here's what here's what I saw what was happening. What did you see what was happening? Let's talk about how we can, make this an easier experience the next time, or an experience that we can be successful getting through the next time. Because I think as parents, in the moment, they're
Mm-hmm.
panicking, and that's causing us to kind of panic, whether we have a panic disorder or not, or it's causing our emotions to get, to elevate. That's not the time for us to be talking about how to get through a panic attack, or how to get through
Right.
a moment where emetophobia is really at a high, or whatever the phobia is. The moment is
Yeah.
before and the moment is after.
Yeah. You know, that incremental baby steps, basically, that you're talking about.
Right.
Not to bring in What About Bob, baby steps to the car. But, you know, we tried that with my daughter. Like, I would say, okay, just if you can just open the car door, like literally
Yes,
just
right.
that much. At the moment was too much because we hadn't at that point.
Mm,
That was right before we actually found therapy that would help. But the first step in her therapy, like I said before, like most emetophobes won't say the word vomit, won't can't
right.
stand to hear the word vomit, nothing. So literally the first step of her therapy was to look at um, just the word, not even the word, V and then star, 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 star. So not even the word
Wow.
vomit, just what almost looked like the word vomit, but the last four letters start out. Just look at that. That was literally the first step. And then she would add a letter, you know, and then eventually work up to saying it out loud. I mean, I have this, I remember because we were at our friend's cabin when she was first starting this. I remember sitting with her in this bedroom in the cabin, having her read a list of synonyms for vomiting,
Wow.
which was really super fun for me too.
Yeah.
But really, like it was a huge milestone for her to hear her saying, you know, barf, puke, blow chunks. That's the grossest one. But like it was huge because she wouldn't ever say anything about it, which was why
Right.
it was so hard to diagnose. And so yeah, those little steps are so huge.
And that's such a good reminder is sometimes those baby steps are exactly that, a baby step. It could be,
Yeah,
what if we do this thing for 10 seconds? 10 seconds, you
yeah,
know? I mean, it doesn't have to be a gigantic thing. I think just we one of the things that my therapist talks to me about a lot, and that is in a lot of resources about mental health, is that we have to rewire some of those synapses that,
hmm,
anxiety in particular is protective in nature. And so we have to rewire those synapses that think we have to be protected.
yeah,
My
yeah.
therapist now had me put a name to my anxiety. So I've named my anxiety and just start talking to my anxiety out loud. That was the entire homework. Like, just talk out loud to your anxiety, who you've named. And it's teeny, teeny, tiny. And I can see it really doing something. And I think that's true for our children too, those little victories. And I hate to be so simplistic because I know it's bigger than that. And both of us have been in situations with our kids, and I'm with myself, where it's much bigger than that. And it feels like you can't surmount anything. But in those moments that you can do something, it's really helpful. Um,
Yeah, and one of Avery's therapists talked about, you know, if you think of it, so much of mental health therapy and doing these things is there's so much to like metaphor and visualizations
yes.
and comparisons that are so helpful. So one of the things that her therapist talked about was it's kind of like if you're riding a bike through campus in the grass, and like, you know, you ride your bike the same way enough times, it creates a rut where your
Mm,
bike tire just goes in that rut. And what you're trying to do, you know, you were talking about it in terms of synapses, which is the literal physical thing that's happening in your brain, but it's what you're doing with like cognitive behavioral therapy is you're creating a new path. And it's hard at first because getting your bike tire to go out of that rut at first takes a lot of effort. But
right.
once you start doing it enough and creating a new pathway, then it becomes easier and easier. And that was a really helpful thing for my daughter to hear, because a lot of times even those little things at the beginning feel really insurmountable. Like, as silly as it
Right.
sounds, seeing V dot dot, you know, V star 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 was rough. And saying the word vomit was huge. And so, but you know, you start to create those pathways. And you and I also talked about this metaphor. Anybody who's been in the ocean before. So one of the things that with anxiety, that is a truth with anxiety, is that doing the thing that you're anxious about is how you become less anxious about it. And it's with a phobia, right? Like, this is what the whole concept of exposure therapy is. But you can't just jump straight to doing something that's really, really terrifying. And this is where the incremental steps come from. But what I've talked with my daughter about when she's been really afraid, actually all three of them, when they've been afraid of something, the anticipation of it, first of all, is 99% of the time the worst part. So like recognizing that once you get to the other side of it, you're going to feel so much better. But also, if you've been to the ocean and you have seen a wave coming, you know that like if you try to run away, if you're in the ocean, up to your hips, let's say, and you see a wave coming, or up to your knees and a wave is coming, if you turn around and try to run away from it, it's going to knock you down, a big wave. And if you try to just like ride it or swim through it, like it's just, or swim with it or whatever, you're just going to get tumbled around. And I actually had that happen to me when I was in Puerto Vallarta. It was pretty terrifying. I thought I was going to die. But the best way to get through a wave that's coming towards you is literally to dive into it and under it. So if you dive into the wave, and this is one of the things that Avery's therapist talked about, was approaching her anxiety as opposed to trying to avoid it, because the avoidance is the issue. So like approaching it, and this visualization of like, okay, here's this big wave coming, here's this thing I'm afraid of, and my instinct is to run away from it, or my instinct is to just try to like grit through it or whatever. But really the best way through it is to dive into it. And if you've ever dived under a wave, it doesn't toss you around at all. It's literally just like going underwater for a second and then coming out the other side. So that's another like metaphor that has helped my kids think through how to get through an anxious experience.
I think that's huge. And I think it is also a good reminder that, again, we need to talk to our kids about the fact that we're not going to be able to take this away from them, but we can teach them to dive into that wave, and we can teach them the safest way to handle a wave. We can teach them, because a really hard part about anxiety, even depression, about so I too, as you know, struggle with medical anxiety, is that a lot of things that we're afraid of, a lot of things that are depressing us, are actually true. I have health anxiety, and I have a chronic condition, and I got breast cancer.
Right.
And so then our kids are watching this, so my youngest has this terrible fear of death, and we moved to California, and her grandma got cancer and died. And then I got cancer. Part of her fear comes from having had some children die in our lives when we were young, some friends. And so these are real things that our kids are feeling. The depression that our kids feel about a lot of what's going on in the world, about this pandemic we were just in, about what they're seeing, those are sadness is a very understandable response to so much of this. Anger is an understandable response. Depression, anxiety, they're feelings that become bigger than I think what the brain can handle at that time, but they're very real feelings, and they're not feelings that our kids are ever going to. We can't tell our kids they're never going to be sad, or never going to be angry, or they're never going to be anxious, or have something to be anxious about. As parents, we can't do that, but we can help them, provide them with definitions. I think that's really important, that we provide our kids with definitions. When your eldest found out what emetophobia was, what a relief. When my youngest found out that OCD is an actual condition and her doctor diagnosed her with it, what a relief. When I found out that other people have anxiety and health anxiety and depression and PTSD, what a relief to learn that I wasn't alone. And I think defining things for our kids so that they understand this, and defining it for parents who might be listening who have kids without any kind of mental illness, your kids can be a part of the solution. If you can help your kids hear these definitions and be aware of these definitions and these experiences, and know how they can be a part of helping, I think that's huge. So that if their friend says to them, I just need to have a conversation out loud with my anxiety right now, so can you hold on? Or I don't want to go on this roller coaster, but I want to walk in the line with you, and then I'm going to leave. Those are huge. And if a child can meet that in a welcoming, warm way, then that's a huge part of the solution. And that's another one of those. It's a benefit that people are talking about this the way that they're talking about it.
Yeah.
So we said that another big struggle for parents and for us for sure has been finding the right help. And right
Mm-hmm.
now, um, there are waiting lists for mental health benefits, and there are people leaving the mental health industry at the
Yeah.
same time. And the pandemic has caused a lot of this. And it is the fact that more people understand that they need help, and that getting help has become normalized as a part of this. So finding help is a huge issue. So if we could touch on that for a minute. So Annie,
Mm-hmm.
you really struggled to find the right help. And yeah, and so what avenues did you take?
Yeah, so with my eldest with the emetophobia, once we pinpointed what it was, and that was purely just online, finding, I don't know if I
Mhm.
tripped across it. I think I kind of just figured out that so much of her issues were worrying about being nauseous and stuff with her stomach. So I looked up fear of nausea or something like that and realized like, oh, this is actual like a thing. And then found a website called emetophobiahelp.org that had a list of therapists, none of which were around here. And then they had some tips for finding a therapist. And so, you know, it was literally just calling therapist after therapist after therapist to ask if they had any experience treating emetophobia. Literally, half of them at least had never heard of it. Others said, no, I don't really, I don't really have any experience with that. And then this one, Jeannie, our angel, her first therapist that dealt with this, she's like, oh, yeah, totally. I can help you with that. And I literally almost burst into tears on the phone because I
Yeah.
had been calling so many people. And I was like, what are we going to do if we can't find somebody that actually knows what they're doing with this? And so that was such a huge relief. And she just happened to take our insurance. And that's the thing that is, whoa, Paula, I could rant for hours about
I know.
the insurance situation and finding a therapist that is
Yep.
actually covered.
Like our insurance
Ugh.
is you get 6 sessions, and then
Mm-hmm.
they can reevaluate and decide if you need more. But I'm telling
Mm-hmm.
you, when you are a child dealing with PTSD or a young adult dealing with PTSD, you need more than 6 sessions. Even
Yeah.
if the therapist deems, oh, you're doing great, you can go on. You don't know what triggers are you don't know if the trigger's gonna come along. I mean, yeah, it's no, the insurance, that was for insurance. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
glad we have insurance, but it needs a lot of help. It needs a lot of
Yes.
help. And in fact, what
Yeah.
I'm using right now is actually an app, and we're not sponsored for this app. This is not a commercial, I promise you. The particular one that I'm using is called BetterHelp. And I'm using it because of finances. I'm only going to be able to use it to get through the transitional period that I'm going through right now with my kids, you know, leaving the nest. And the reason that I needed it is that I'm finding that them leaving the nest, they're at the ages that I was when my stepfather basically threw me out of the family. And so it's triggering to me in that way. And so I'm using BetterHelp to get through the transition time. So I have a therapist that I can talk to every week, and somebody that I can text with, and somebody that I can get homework from. And in that way, it's been great. It's prohibitively expensive for many, many people. It is, like I said, something I will only be able to use for 2 or 3 months to get me through this transition. But if you are able to, there are apps out there. I was worried about it because I thought, what if you're getting someone who's not really trained well? And I went through several therapists before finding the one that I have now. She actually has a PhD. She knows her stuff. She specializes in phobias. And so, yes, you probably, like anything else, like going to a restaurant or anything else, you're going to have to weed through some different um, resources, but the apps have been good for me. You're going to have to weed through therapists too and find one that connects with your child very well. Um, there are some great websites out there where parents can start. I'm looking here. You mentioned, what is the book that on emetophobia that you used that was so great?
It's called the Emetophobia Manual, and it just came out last November, I think. So we haven't had that for very long, but it's hugely helpful. I mean, if anybody's kids are dealing with, or if they're dealing with emetophobia, I mean, it's seriously amazing, amazing book. It's got 5 stars on Amazon.
Oh,
Super
that's
worth it.
great. And we can put that in the show notes. A couple of
Yeah.
two books that I've found really helpful for my oldest two going through PTSD. And these are books that I would love for them to read. And one of them is reading one of them right now, but also it's been really important for me to read. And one of those is The Body Keeps the Score, and the other one is called What Happened to You. And both of those have been really helpful just as a beginning part. And again, a tool in our toolbox as parents, helping our kids through these kinds of things. Another book that I'm reading right now is called Panic Free. And another one is called The As If Principle. These are super simplistic forms of cognitive behavioral therapy. But in the As If Principle, I started reading it because I'm afraid of, one of my phobias is bridges, again, because my parents would drink and we all be in the back of our Chevrolet with no seatbelts, and they would be drunk and we would drive over the Coronado Bridge. And so that was one of my phobias. And this book got me through it in the most simplistic possible way that you can imagine. And as long as the people in the car are okay with the fact that what I have to do is I laugh maniacally when I go over a bridge. And the idea is that it's telling my body, oh, you're not anxious. You think something's funny. Your heart rate is up and you're sweating because you think something's hysterical. And I have driven over bridges with the car, having kids who are not a part of my family. And I say, either tell me jokes or just understand that I'm going to laugh maniacally. We get over the bridge, everything's fine, and everybody's great. And they help me, and it works wonderfully. So if you're feeling like you could use a place to start as a parent with some of these things, these are good starter options for you to put in your toolbox as you're looking for the care that your kids need. Now, the other resource is if you do have a child with suicidal ideation, different states have different protocols. So I think preemptively that parents do need to look into what is available near you should there be a situation where suicidal ideation is a problem. So for example, for a lot of places, there's a 72-hour hold in the hospital. For some kids, that might be exactly what they need. For other kids, that might be antithetical to what they need. So these are other areas where contacting the medical professionals in your area and finding out what is available to you preemptively is really helpful. And that maybe that's a good place for neighborhood group conversations on a Facebook neighborhood group. Hey, I'm not facing this situation right now, but as my kids get a little bit older, I'm wondering, what are the protocols in our area if a child faces suicidal ideation? Or what are the protocols if a neighbor kid or your friend's kid comes to you or comes to your friend and says, hey, I'm feeling suicidal? You know, these are things we as parents and as a community can figure out ahead of time so that we're prepared when that comes, because it really does vary according to where you live.
You know, one last thing too is that I wish we had I wish we had started looking for help earlier. I mean, it's always, hindsight is always 2020, right? So like it's easy to say like I wish we'd figured this out earlier. I do wish we had figured it out earlier, but I wish that we had recognized the signs that something was beyond just normal amounts of anxiety or whatever, and that we had started searching for help and looking for help earlier. Because and there's nothing wrong with, you know, if I would even go so far as to say like at the first signs that you have a question if something is not right, call a therapist and get an appointment if you can, because it doesn't hurt in any way to have you know, a therapy appointment. It's like getting a checkup at the doctor. And I remember I have a family member who had a sort of a almost like a psychotic break or mental breakdown thing, which partially was due to sleep and partially due to overwork and partially due to rock bottom vitamin D levels, which I guess we could get into a whole other thing about nutrition. But he got therapy after that experience, and we talked about, this was around the same time that my daughter started therapy, and we were talking about how why are these not things that we just teach in school as a matter of normal school stuff? And what we were talking about was cognitive behavioral therapy and all the things that I learned just sitting in on my daughter's therapy sessions in the first few times, just about how the brain works, how the amygdala works, what kind of is the functioning in the brain when anxiety is happening, and how to disrupt the cycle, all those things. I mean, who could not use that?
Right.
Who could not use
Right.
those tools? Like, we all could use those tools, even if we don't have a disorder, just to learn to manage normal anxiety things that happen, or sadness, or whatever. And obviously the normal experiences of those things are different than they are with a disorder, but all of us could be helped understanding how our brains actually work and what causes these things that can cause it to spin out of control or whatever, and how to rein it back in. I mean, there's so many tools that I learned in her therapy that I was like, these are things everybody should know. Why are we not teaching these things just as a matter of course?
Well, and I think so much of what you're saying, Annie, right now comes down to normalizing mental health deviations. I mean, I want to say, like, I don't even know that I mean, obviously we're talking about mental health disorders, but there are also just, differences that people have. And I think so much of it is, if you can say to someone, hey, has your teenager ever said, I keep thinking about suicide, you know, to be able to have those conversations in judgment-free situations, I think is so important, because as our kids get older, we become more and more as parents afraid of talking about the things. When it was that they threw their orange juice on the floor as a toddler, everybody at some point is like, oh yeah, my kids did that too. Or, the kid who spreads their poopy diaper on the wall at some, those things don't have the shame attached to them that we tend to attach to mental health issues. And especially as our kids get older. So we go from, we talk about every single thing that happens when our kids are little, to we don't feel like we can talk about anything that's happening when our kids are older. And also, and a part of that is out of respect for our kids, but then a part of that is just that there's so much shame around it. And, I think it would be really great if you could easily go on a Facebook parenting group for your neighborhood and say, hey, what are the protocols in this neighborhood if someone should come to me and admit that they're feeling suicidal? Who are the therapists in this neighborhood that, should I need to get my kid into therapy, would be a good place to start? What are some of the things you see happening in our local schools that might be contributing to our kids' mental health challenges? I think being able to talk about these things, as hard as that is the first step. And I'm really thrilled that our kids said, yeah, go ahead and talk about these things. I'm thrilled because it means there has been a shift. There's been a shift in kids to know how important it is that we talk about these things. And I think my kids saying that to me certainly empowered me in many ways to be much more open with people in my life about my own mental health challenges, and people who aren't even like in my immediate family, but the people who to be able to say to a group of kids, all right, tell a joke or help me listen to me laugh right now, because that's what's going to get me over this bridge with my anxiety. I think that's huge, and a really positive way that we're moving in terms of mental health for our kids.
Yeah, I have a really specific memory of when my oldest, she had had one session with Jeannie, that angel therapist. So she had one session with her, and then our family went to our like summer family camp, Baha'i camp that we go to every year. And that year was her worst. That was the worst year of her emetophobia. That year at camp, she literally didn't leave the cabin
Yeah.
almost ever. Like, she just basically stayed in the cabin. She came out a few times for a meal, and other than that, like, didn't leave the cabin, which was heartbreaking because she loved camp again. But during that year, because everybody's of course like, where is she? And we just explained what was going on. And I remember sitting around this picnic table with, I don't know, probably 7 or 8 or 10 people who just started sharing like their experiences with therapy, their experiences with medication, the stuff that they'd been through. And it was such a just very normal, open conversation, as if we were talking about, it's like if old people sit around and talk about their aches and pains or something like that. You know what I mean? Like, it was just so very normal. And I remember being struck by it. Like, wow, this is really different. I don't remember anybody having these conversations when I was young. Like, when we were kids, if you went to therapy, it was because something was like wrong. You know, like
Right. That was the
that was the
perception. Yeah.
idea. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
What a
it's great.
gift.
It's great. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we're going to put some resources in our show notes, including some essays that we've written about anxiety and different mental health challenges. All of these books we've talked about. Is there anything you want to say recapping this?
I mean, this is a topic that we could literally talk
I
about
know.
for hours. There's a bunch of things that I thought about sharing or talking about, but we just don't have time for it. But we do want to come back with another episode with the kids who want to share whatever they want to share,
Right.
and I mean that might be a nice episode for parents to have their kids listen to if they're looking for, kids' perspectives on these kinds of things.
And if
So,
anybody wants to ask our kids a question, they can do that
yeah,
by going to our Instagram account, which is what's our Instagram? Motherhood and More Podcast. Is that right?
I believe so. Yeah.
Yeah, it'll say it in the outro, the intro, and it'll be in the show notes. They can go there
Yeah.
to ask any questions if they have something specific to ask. And I want to thank everybody who's listening or watching, because it says that you are really in that part of that community that's wanting to work through this for yourself, work through this for your children, work through this for other people's children. And I think that's important. And I wish I could give everybody a big COVID safe hug and say, you're not alone. You are not alone in this at all.
Yeah, that is one thing that I did think about throughout this conversation. And I've thought about many times, and we've talked about with our kids many times because they've even brought it up. Like, our kids have struggled, it's been hard, and they have every single level of support that they could possibly have. They
Right.
have a stable, loving family. They have parents who care and are engaged and are trying to help. They have supportive friends around them. And it's still been hard. And I think about the kids who don't have those
Right.
things. I think about the kids whose parents are clueless or they're in abusive situations or whatever. I can't even imagine what that would be like for a kid to not have support with all of this stuff.
Well, and how many kids nowadays do turn to the internet? So there are great places that
Mm-hmm.
kids can go on the internet for this
Mm-hmm.
kind of help and support. And there are terrible places that kids can go on the internet that can exacerbate the problem. And that's hard. The problem can be
Yeah.
improved or it can be exacerbated with a lot of these sources. So it really is important that we build communities where there are safe spaces for kids to feel supported and for parents to feel supported, because
Yes.
hopefully it starts with parents. I mean, the beneficial stuff starts with parents. So whew,
Yeah.
that was one.
That's a lot. Ooh.
That was a topic.
That was a topic.
We are now I'm going to go help my daughter get ready for prom.
Aw, that's exciting.
I know.
Although it's kind of funny, like, I was sick for my prom. I mean, I went.
Yeah.
This was pre-COVID days when you actually did things when you didn't feel well. I was like, I think I had a fever and I just was like, didn't feel, I wasn't like vomiting or anything like that. And I wasn't bedridden, but I just didn't feel good. And I went
Yeah.
anyway. And I felt really bad for my date, who wasn't somebody that I knew super well. It was just a guy that I was in choir with, who was a really nice guy, but it was like a surprise when he asked me to prom because I was like, okay, that's.
So do you know, Annie, that you don't have to have dates nowadays? So when I was going to prom, you had to have a date. And you don't now. And I'm so happy about that kids don't have to have dates. I was not a good date for my date. It was a friend and I was anxious. And so I had I'm sure I was not a great date for my date. And also it was 1986. And do you know what our prom theme was? Have I told you this?
What?
Gone with the Wind.
Oh my gosh. We got to talk about our hatred for Gone with the Wind.
Okay. But also, our prom theme was a movie about slavery, and I like it's a horrible prom theme. It's a terrible prom theme. I cannot believe that was a prom theme. My daughter's is old Hollywood, and you would be very happy to know that her dress cost less than my prom dress cost in 1986 because she got it at a thrift store.
Love it.
And so it costs $30 less than what I spent in 1986. This is so exciting. And she's wearing her Doc Martens because you have to wear closed-toed shoes, which is great. But she's like, if I'm wearing closed-toed shoes, I'm wearing really comfortable closed-toed shoes. So she's wearing
Why
Doc
do they have
Martens.
to wear? Why
I
do they have
think
to
so.
wear
I don't
closed-toed
know.
shoes?
I mean, when you think about it, somebody could step on someone else and hurt them. Those, I guess, I don't know.
I'm sorry. It's just that you're in Southern California. The idea that you would have to wear closed-toed shoes in Southern California in May is just
I
throwing
know,
me.
but what a gift for these kids because they can wear boots or whatever. They don't. You have to
That's
feel
so funny.
this pressure to wear like fancy, uncomfortable shoes.
Yeah, I've seen this trend of girls wearing their like prom dresses or fancy dresses or whatever with tennis shoes, which is
Yeah,
really
I love
interesting.
it. I love it. I 100% love it. And they're not using limos. They're not going to a fancy dinner. They're going to have a picnic. One of the kids is going to Trader Joe's to pick up a bunch of stuff for a picnic, which I also love. I mean, the night will cost them the price of the ticket plus whatever, they spent on their outfits, which most of these kids are thrift store kids. So,
I love it.
I know. I love it too. So yeah, we have prom. Then my daughter has a recital and then we go into tomorrow and then we go into all the graduation
Oh my gosh.
stuff, Annie.
Oh
my gosh.
Wow.
You know how often I'm going to be in Washington curled up in a ball on your floor?
Yes, please come. That's
I
so
know.
funny. Yeah, I don't have a graduate yet until, well, next year. My
Next year.
oldest will graduate in December, and then my youngest will graduate in the spring. Oh,
Yeah, I could have used it being spread out a little bit. I could have used, my oldest daughter moved out a few years ago. So I feel I've gotten okay with that. We're at a place where I'm okay with that. Now my son and daughter will be leaving within 2 weeks. In fact, we'll be driving my son to his destination on my daughter's graduation trip, which she asked not for any gifts. She wanted to go see Shakespeare. So we'll be driving to Shakespeare, dropping my son off. So when we drive back, he won't be with us and he'll be on his own. And then 2 weeks later, I'll take my tour, maybe 4 weeks later, take my youngest to college. So we're going to definitely have, we've talked about this, a podcast in the future about this whole college process for those of you, or not even just the college process, but the post high school process, because all three of mine have done something very different, which we're great with. And Annie's have done different things as well. And so we'll have a conversation about that. But for now, you have anything interesting coming up in your week before we say goodbye?
I hate to be trite and talk about the weather, but it has been ridiculously cold here.
Here too.
It's so stupid. We're like, it's mid-May. We had a frost warning last night. What the frick? So we've been busy doing yard work though, which is fun. Yeah. So we have we have our house and then we own an Airbnb right next door that we used to live in, and we've been redoing the backyard there. And we did a whole little xeriscaping thing with rocks that I designed it, and then my husband like did all the work, and it's been really cool. It's really sweet. So that's been what we've been doing.
That's awesome. And I forgot to mention that I was knitting the whole time, a sweater for one of those graduates, not one of my graduates, but one of her friends. And so I know, Annie, the greatest disappointment in our relationship is that you're not knitting at the same time that I'm knitting. And that's
but I am wearing the socks that you knitted me.
You are. It looks so good.
And my oldest crocheted herself a cute little like tank top thing. I should have brought her in to show you.
Oh, that's awesome. My youngest is finishing up as we speak. She's crocheting her cardigan that she'll wear over her graduation dress.
Oh,
so I love it. Okay, we have talked all that we can talk.
Long time.
I don't even know how to make this thing stop, but I guess we just go. I don't want to end it, but I want to pause the recording. Listen, thank you everybody for listening. We forgot to mention, our tech guy is my husband, Peter, since my son has to train him since my son will be leaving. So thank you, Peter, for all this tech help. And thank you all for listening. Next time we will have some kids on to talk with us.
Yay.
Bye, Annie. I love you.
Everyone. Bye. Love you too.
Our music was written and performed by Avery Renault.
Our music and podcast is produced by Severin Fitzgibbons, known in the music world as Thera Jean.
If you have comments or questions for us, you can reach us at podcast@motherhoodandmore.
You can also find us on social media. Look for our links in the description.